Hi and welcome to tonight's session on cognitive bias in the literature search. This is an event that is part of an ongoing series known as Context, which I'll explain in a bit if you don't already know what it is. My name is Matthew Chase. I'm the San Marcos campus librarian. So hi, I think I recognize some of you from the San Marcos campus. And if I haven't seen you, either because you're on another campus or we just haven't crossed paths, hi. And I think this is a great way to kind of introduce each other in this kind of format. But yeah, so this session's basically, as the title suggests, going to cover into the issues of cognitive bias, especially as it mounts on clinicians and evidence-based practitioners, and even health sciences researchers, especially as it regards a very, probably an understated significant part of the research process, which is the literature search, the actual gathering and curating and evaluating of the existing evidence to inform your own research or your own clinical decision making. And so this is it's a relatively newer topic regarding cognitive bias and how that actually is affecting that part of the process. So I'm really excited to kind of share it with y'all. We'll get into more about like the specific types of cognitive biases that can manifest, as well as maybe some strategies or techniques that we can actually help to debias our literature search, and hopefully by proxy debiasing our research and debiasing our evidence-based practice. So yeah, I think one of the things I do want to state is that at any point, even though I kind of will do this initial part kind of more in a traditional quote-unquote lecture format, feel free to cut in at any point. You can either put anything into the chat. More than happy to keep a look for that. Any thoughts or questions that you might have. And if you want to, you can also unmute yourself at any point. I love having a conversation, so don't feel like you can't interrupt me. I have no problems with that at all. I don't really consider it interruption. I figure that's just more, a moment to where we can really conversate and really dialogue about these type of complex matters. So yeah, so with that, we'll move on. So what's the agenda for this session? So essentially, then we'll also go into the nature of medical uncertainty. What is that, and how does it manifest, and how does that influence cognitive biases? And then we'll also go into a handful of different biases that can manifest as a result of uncertainty. We definitely can't cover them all. Actually, from the research, it's actually been documented 150 plus biases that we all have in some shape or form, and they kind of emerge in different kind of contexts and situations. But I'm going to focus on some that I think are probably the most relevant, especially in the context of literature searching. And then also we want some strategies on how do we really debias our literature search. Is it even possible? And we'll kind of go into that as well. And then one of the last things is about the Labyrinth, which is a really exciting activity that I've revamped for this particular session. So I'm really excited to kind of go into that. So stay tuned. Later on, we'll definitely go into what exactly am I referring to as the Labyrinth. And essentially that'll be it at the end. So really excited for all of these different elements, and feel free to interact in any way that you want to during this session. So what is medical uncertainty? So essentially, one of the things about medical uncertainty is that it is the phenomenon in which a health practitioner or a researcher, really I should add too, who enters an ambiguous patient situation, particularly during that patient-practitioner interaction or encounter, in which as a result of that ambiguity and that type of vagueness of the situation, the practitioner or the researcher experiences a sense of frustration, a sense of doubt, and or intolerance. There's a variety of different factors that can actually contribute to what is medical uncertainty. And it kind of just depends on the situation, and it also depends on the patient you're interacting with, or yourself even as well in your own kind of position. So we can talk about from the complexity of the given situation, especially with the patient's health maybe. Maybe there's certain aspects about their health condition or their outcomes that is exceedingly complex. Maybe there's comorbidity, for example. There's different types of diagnoses kind of going on and interacting with each other. So it really makes it a lot more complicated in terms of their treatment and process. It could be about, as a clinician, their own lack of relevant medical knowledge when it comes to that specific situation. That can definitely happen, especially even for students such as yourself, if you are one. That might be definitely a thing where, especially as you're kind of learning about these different disorders and diseases and health conditions that can manifest with your patients and the different ways that they can interact with the patient specifically in terms of what symptoms kind of manifest, what don't, in what ways are they really responding well to the treatment, maybe in some ways they're not. And yeah, so you might have still a growing sense of knowledge, but not necessarily sufficient enough by yourself to really handle the situation. And there are definitely some strategies on how to do that, on how to address that. And then even the overabundance of available health information, which it seems odd that would be a contributing factor, but really because of the fact that with the current state of medical knowledge that is out there through scholarly literature and how it's just exploding in terms of the expanding limits of scholarly literature that is being produced, that is being accessed, and so on. It's overwhelming, honestly. There's not one clinician, not one person even, who can just readily consume all the available information that's out there. And some of that information may not even be accessible to you. Just because of paywalls. Maybe you have to pay for the actual access to a certain database per se. If you're newly graduated, you don't necessarily have access to the USAH library like you did as a current student, even though you still have interlibrary loan services, but there's still some limitations there, and so on. It's just there's so much information just in general to consume, even if it was freely available online. Another thing to consider too is cultural linguistic barriers between the patient and the practitioner. So again, this is kind of depending on the interaction itself with your patient, their own composition of identities when it comes to cultural, linguistic, socioeconomic, religious, a whole assortment of different factors, and even as they interact with your own composition of identities. And I think that's something we definitely discussed in previous sessions when we talked about intersectionality as that kind of theoretical lens to really help explore and examine those different types of dynamics, particularly when it comes to unequal power distribution. But yeah, it definitely contributes to medical uncertainty. So as a result, clinicians understandably, and this is just a human behavior just in general, when faced with this type of uncertainty, this type of ambiguity or vagueness of a situation, we often take cognitive shortcuts in an attempt to resolve this type of uncertainty. And that's really about where we lead into cognitive bias. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that we're going through these types of shortcuts. Instead of making very deliberate but very slow types of thought patterns or decision making, sometimes we kind of just make some instantaneous or instinctual decisions based on our own knowledge, based on our own experiences, based on what we think might be the best approach to something. And we do that just on an everyday basis, even as a student, as a at home, at work, in any kind of situation. We tend to make those type of situations because we may be constrained by time, we may be constrained by resources, we may be constrained by support. And so as a result, sometimes it's necessary to make those shortcuts. What happens though, and what we should be really aware of, is when those cognitive shortcuts, or they're also known as heuristics, are taken to resolve uncertainty, but ultimately actually lead to a systemic error in the decision-making process. It's when it actually produces negative consequences that into the decision-making process that reproduce certain outcomes that are not favorable, either to yourself in some ways, but more particularly to your patient or even to your research participant as well. So this is where we kind of go into what are the specific cognitive biases that I'm really talking about. There's several. Like I said, in the literature, there's a documented 150 plus biases to count. Obviously, we don't have enough time in this particular session alone to cover all of them, but I do want to cover a few instances of where that can really manifest, especially as it's relevant to you as either a student, as a professional, even if you are an emerging professional, like you're still learning to become one, or as a scholar, as a researcher. This can definitely manifest in a few different ways, especially when we talk about the literature search process. So the first one I kind of wanted to broach here is search satisficing. Essentially, this is the tendency to conclude a literature search when acceptable criteria for the search or the inquiry are met. Probably a really good example of what this means is, say, as a student, you are faced with an assignment where you were supposed to cite at least 5 scholarly sources. Whatever the number may be, it doesn't really matter in this case. But what matters is the minimum. So a student who may be pressed for time, maybe didn't have enough, didn't give themselves enough leeway or flexibility to really focus on this particular assignment. Maybe they had to do an overnighter type of thing right before the due date, for whatever reason. And as a result, they kind of interpret that minimum as being the sufficient or acceptable criteria, that all they have to do is pull up 5 scholarly sources and meet that quota per se. But obviously that can be problematic in some ways, because the problem is, were those 5 sources really enough to support whatever assignment you were doing, whether maybe it was something to do with like a persuasive argument, or really reviewing the literature and seeing like what exactly is the evidence saying about this particular topic or this particular question. And so really, are you getting that really complete and accurate answer about a perhaps much more complex topic than you were initially intending, that maybe 5 sources just wasn't enough? The other problem too is that if you assume that the first 5 sources that you collected were enough, those 5 sources may be potentially relevant, but they may not be by themselves the best ones to go with. So yeah, there might be, like on the second page of the results, there might have been some better results to find, better articles that were much more robust, much more relevant to what you were actually looking for than the ones you initially found. I can readily admit in undergrad and a little bit in grad school, I will admit there were a couple of times when I would do this. I would just I'm just pressed for time. I'm competing with other classes and other priorities just in life. And I just need to get this done. So sometimes I did go for just the minimum. And it's only until later that I really kind of reflected on that and just like, sure, I got the work done. Maybe I got a decent grade, but did I really get a full appreciation of what the potential evidence was saying, or what answers lay out there? So not that you have to admit that to yourself, like maybe as a reflective moment for yourself if you ever want to think about that, definitely. But yeah, I mean, it can even happen in professional lives as well. Again, even more so for clinicians, when you only have maybe a few minutes between patients and you really need to do a deep dive into the literature because you don't know about the next patient's like health condition as much, just in terms of its epidemiology and so on. And so you may just be pressed for time. And as a result, you may be hurried and have to resort to this type of cognitive bias. But again, will it provide you the best approach or decision-making process for that sake? So another one that's really, probably really common that I kind of see from time to time, especially for myself, I need to always be aware of this particular one, is premature closure. And so this is basically similar to search satisficing with a certain caveat or a certain nuance to it, but it's the tendency to conclude a literature search if little or no information is found. It's different from search satisficing because in the sense that even though they're both concluding the search prematurely, this one in particular is concluding it because they didn't find any information that wasn't readily available. So I do encounter this with students when I'm interacting with them, and even faculty too, or just clinicians who are either alumni or just faculty that are also practicing professionals as well, where because they can't find any available evidence regarding their particular topic, they kind of just conclude, well, there's nothing out there then, because I couldn't find it. The problem is, though, it kind of raises questions like, which databases did you search? Did you search all the appropriate ones? Did you search for ones that maybe you weren't even aware of, or even that you were familiar, like unfamiliar with? Or did you just kind of go for your go-to routes when it came to doing a search for that particular topic? Did you choose the right keywords? Maybe there's another type of discipline or field that is talking about your topic, but because you used keywords or strategies that you related to because of your own experience, your own profession, you couldn't find that type of evidence. I can give an example of that actually historically. Back in the 1970s, there was a clinician who actually went up to their librarians actually and was kind of complaining about the fact that they couldn't find any evidence about medical safety errors, even though that was a very popular topic at the time, but they couldn't find any literature when it came to that. So the librarians kind of did a deep dive and kind of provided their own perspective on that, and found that the clinician just wasn't probably looking in the right places. Particularly, this clinician was searching through like PubMed and other health sciences related databases that didn't have that type of literature being produced at that time. But the librarians instead recommended to a humanities related type of database that actually did focus on medical safety errors. It was just being talked about in a different way, but it was still the same type of phenomenon. And as a result, that clinician was able to actually curate a lot of evidence towards that. And unfortunately, even though I can't remember the exact name of the clinician at this point, they actually were one of the leading founders of the patient safety movement back in the 1970s. And so as a result of that type of interaction, they were able to actually find enough evidence to really kind of inform this ongoing issue, even though maybe it was just not talked about within their own field. So something to kind of consider as well. Automation bias. So this is actually kind of related to the story I just talked about in terms of the question of what search tools or technologies are you really depending on? So just out of curiosity, within the chat, or you can unmute yourself, what are your go-to search tools when you're faced with a topic and you're just having to go find some scholarly information or any information at all about it? What are your go-to sources in particular? Just kind of curious. Let's see. Google Scholar, yep. That's probably a very popular one for sure. PubMed, yeah, definitely go-to, right, for clinicians. Let's see, anyone else in particular? Or any consensus on those two that were being offered? But yeah, I mean, like, honestly, yeah, Google Scholar and PubMed are probably the go-to ones. I mean, I think I even teach them in Evidence-Informed Practice 1 from the very beginning for incoming students. Yeah, PubMed is your go-to as well. Google Scholar, if you have access to a school online library, you'd have access to their databases as well. USA, oh yeah, Search USA, for sure, definitely. That would be another great go-to, that one that we promote quite heavily as part of the library. So yeah, and none of these particular resources are like worse than any other. It's just that they're all different in different uh, criteria that they kind of collect, which I can kind of talk about. But essentially with the automation bias is that if we tend to over-rely on a specific resource or tool during a literature search, that can also reproduce systemic error in our decision making when it comes to research or when it comes to even clinical treatment options and so on, and approaches with our patients. And so even though, yeah, we may have our go-to routes in terms of either Google Scholar or Search USA or PubMed, it's just important to realize that none of them by themselves are like the only end-all be-all resource to depend on. They all have different limitations. And that's actually what I'm going to talk about later on in the upcoming session on systemic bias in internet search engines, such as Google Scholar, and also scholarly databases, such as PubMed. And yeah, it's just important to realize that, you know, they all have their limitations. As I kind of illustrated with that one example of the clinician not looking through a humanities database versus just PubMed, which focuses more on health sciences, more the clinical pathological side of things. So yeah. Yeah, so the non-invented here bias. So you may be wondering why I'm talking about cognitive bias as if it were related to racism, transphobia, heteronormativity, socioeconomic inequities, and so on. True. In the research, it's not necessarily equivalent to them. And even in this session, I do not want to stress that cognitive bias is basically the equivalent to racism. But what I want to stress here, and this particular bias in particular, I think highlights this, is that these biases can reproduce certain elements of racism or socioeconomic disparities and so on in different ways. This one's probably the most clear cut in that instance with the not invented here bias, which is basically the tendency to search for and prioritize information published in one's own country. This is pretty common, actually, based on my own experiences, just with people in general throughout my career as a librarian. And I think it definitely does affect that of the health sciences practitioners as well. Basically, within the health sciences, there have been documented cases of this clear bias towards going for one's own country, but this is really namely for those who are living in or born and raised in the global north, shall we say, which is basically the United States and Western Europe for the most parts. And as a result, the priority for information being published elsewhere, particularly like maybe Southeast Asia, China, and Africa, and even Latin America, which are actually steadily producing a lot more literature, especially within the health sciences, that information, that evidence is not being valued or regarded as highly for a variety of reasons, being that it may not necessarily be a note of racism per se, but it may be a note of saying that because the evidence is being produced in a country that does not reflect my own, therefore the evidence being produced there and the samples, the population that is being evaluated is not reflective of the patients I'm treating. Maybe in terms of like racial, ethnic, religious, cultural, and other demographic related reasons. But the problem with that is it does have its own shortcomings because it assumes that within the diversity, especially within like the United States and so on, that we're not going to be able to somehow find correlations and connections with what's going on in the rest of the world. And then also the fact is that one thing we have to really consider is that the evidence-based practice movement within the United States and for the large part, Western Europe, is not the leading figures in that regard. In actuality, there's several areas within evidence-based medicine and practice that other parts of the world are excelling at way more than we are. And I'm saying that as someone who's living in the United States. And so there is that kind of challenging to that assumption that because the so-called industrialized world of the United States, Western Europe, is more advanced, quote unquote, therefore our evidence-based practice and evidence-based information will be of better quality. The other thing to consider too is that in other parts of the world, a certain disease or health condition might be happening way more often in their areas, and as a result, they're looking into it more. They're looking into the epidemiology, treatment options, experimental and really innovative and unique treatment approaches that we're not necessarily considering as well. So there's a lot of problems that can result from not invented here bias. It's not to say that, you know, if you were to look into evidence that more closely reflects your own patients or your own communities that you're looking into, that it's wrong to just focus on that. It's just to say, it's really just to provide a question to you, like how important is that in this particular case versus that one? And is it always going to be universally better just to only prefer US-based type of research or Western European type of research versus something else? Let's see. So confirmation bias. This is probably something some of you may just have some knowledge about, just in general. But essentially, confirmation bias is the tendency to find, select, and use information that supports prior attitudes and beliefs. And this can be really manifesting in the case of when the researcher or practitioner has particularly strong feelings towards a certain issue, particularly controversial issues such as vaccination, alternative and complementary medicine approaches, reproductive matters even. And as a result, they may overlook evidence that contradicts their own preferred approach or identifies gaps in the literature. So it's definitely important to consider this as well. I think this one's probably the most popularly documented bias in particular. So there is a lot of evidence to show that confirmation bias does happen quite a bit, especially even with clinicians and health practitioners who might be, and it's not necessarily only about controversial issues, it could be just the fact that you have this certain preference for certain therapeutic interventions because in your line of experience, they have worked. And therefore you may try to apply them in other situations that maybe they're not necessarily the strongest or the most appropriate for your particular patient, especially if they have unfavorable feelings towards that particular treatment option for whatever reason they may have. And as a result, it might be frustrating to you when they're not necessarily confirming with what you want to, how you want to approach that. So, but yeah, there's definitely that bias to consider as well. Framing effect. Essentially, framing effect is the overall influence of decisions in the literature based on how the topic was presented and how it was phrased. Essentially, this is really important because basically the way you ask a question or how you phrased it is going to really determine how you're going to search for it. And what kind of evidence you're going to look for specifically to find the answer, or at least the potential answer to it. It's going to change the search parameters and the outcomes depending on how that topic has been originally developed, how it was originally conceptualized. And this actually can touch on elements of or issues regarding racist research and even research that reproduces certain sexist norms and socioeconomic issues. Namely, actually, in previous sessions, we talked about this in terms of how you phrased your research question. And say you were really interested in looking into how does heart disease affect the Black communities? And maybe you have a question that's kind of phrased as, you know, or a hypothesis that's phrased as Blacks have a higher incidence of heart disease or cardiovascular problems or whatever the issue might be than other communities. But the problem is the way that's phrased makes it seem like it's just by being Black or being whatever identity you're looking into, that disease is inherent to it. It's somehow biologically, intrinsically, or genetically inherent to being black, rather than their experiences of being black within a society that doesn't bode well or doesn't provide the same type of access, the same type of rights even than other communities, particularly white communities, such as where I belong in. So therefore, I would probably have higher advantages in my access to healthcare and therefore receive better treatment for maybe my own cardiovascular problems than someone who is black. So that's something to consider as well. Yeah. I mean, this is a great comment or question here. So does this relate to the PICO question? Yeah, actually, this is something that I talk about actually as a potential strategy around that, of how to be much more mindful about population differences and the diversity within those different populations that you're looking into. Namely, because in the PICO approach, it specifically has population keywords. And so it's really important to kind of consider those. But yeah, just overall, just really consider how you're phrasing a question. Are you really trying to address how heart disease is a factor of being black, or is that a factor of being black and trying to navigate a certain healthcare system that poses barriers, poses challenges to their own care and outcomes, and the racism embedded into that? So yeah, no, I appreciate that question. That's actually something we do talk about quite a bit in the previous sessions too. Overconfidence bias. So basically, it seems like it's similar to confirmation bias, but it actually has its own differences. But essentially, it's the inflated belief in oneself that they know more about the topic than they actually do. And essentially, with overconfidence bias, this actually happens to be more about the clinician's own assumptions about what they know or what they think they know. And so they may already be pre-generating the answer to a question before they even search for the evidence. Probably one of the classic examples is if you're in undergrad, I'm sure, and I've done this too, for sure, is that I already came to a predetermined conclusion about an assignment, like in terms of writing up something, in terms of an argument or just about a topic, and I'm finding the answer, but I already have the answer that I think is the best, and I already write that up before I even go look through the literature and actually inform that. Instead, what I'm going to do is kind of do the confirmation bias, where I'm going to start looking for information that already confirms that. So they do tend to blend in together. So that's why they're kind of like, in some ways they've been considered interchangeable, but they're actually quite separate. But yeah, so if you already know the potential answer to a question, then you're likely to fail to conduct a really comprehensive and systematic search for the evidence, because really you're just going to cherry pick, essentially. And even when you come across the fact that maybe your evidence is not actually working out for you because it's not actually answering the question or answering the question in the way you were intending, you either do a premature closure because you're going to say like, well, there's no evidence that actually supports what I'm doing, so therefore there's no evidence to speak of, and just kind of dismiss that challenging or contradictory evidence. So there's a lot of complications when it comes to overconfidence. But yeah, so it's always just to acknowledge the fact that we don't always know the answer to everything. and that comes even for novice practitioners and even for experienced practitioners. There's always something to learn, essentially. And then one of the last ones I kind of wanted to touch on was blind spot bias. I'm not really a fan of the name blind spot, but it's the only name that's been provided for it. But I find it has some ableist type of terminology, especially when it regards like vision related impairments. But yeah, that's essentially the official moniker for this bias. I'm going to try to look to see if there's a potentially better or more inclusive term for it. But essentially, this is a failure to acknowledge that cognitive bias can impact one's literature search. This is really kind of the center bias that influences pretty much all the other ones as they manifest within your search. Because if you feel like you're not prone to this type of bias, or that because of your experience or because of your education that you're somehow less susceptible to it, that's how it's manifesting, is that that failure to acknowledge that even when you're fully experienced, when you're fully educated, cognitive bias does seep in some shape or form. And that's something that we kind of have to acknowledge to ourselves. And that's actually something I'll be talking about in just a minute. But yeah, it's probably the center of all these different types of systemic error thinking patterns. So yeah, I'm going to briefly talk about the anatomy of the unicorn problem. I always find this is a really great topic to talk about because it actually relates to all these different cognitive biases and how they kind of intermingle with each other, how they kind of reproduce each other to create this problem that I've kind of come to call the unicorn article. It's basically how I've seen where practitioners, students, faculty alike, no matter who it is, we'll try to find the one perfect article that will summarize everything about their particular topic, the problem that they're investigating, or ultimately provide the answer, the all-inclusive answer, end-all be-all to whatever topic they're looking into. There's obviously some problems with that, which we'll touch on right now. Namely, there is the idea that you're trying to look for an article, this perfect article that will be published within the last 5 years. The problem is sometimes the article is not going to be published within the last 5 years for different reasons. Maybe because the answer was already gathered years back, and therefore there's not a whole lot of current research on that particular topic because it's been at this time quote unquote fully investigated to, but it does beg the question, maybe there's a part of that question or that topic that maybe hasn't been fully explored, and that's kind of opening up to you to do the work of researching that particular gap. But there are times when there's certain topics that are just not talked about anymore, just in terms of the fact that, at least from the medical community, they feel that problem has been explored to the max. Another problem is it does assume that articles get published fairly quickly. That's not the case. A lot of articles, especially if you're talking about peer-reviewed articles, there's a long publication process by the time it was fully written by the authors, and then it gets submitted to a journal and then has to get reviewed several times by a panel of experts and gets kind of scrutinized for its rigor of methodology and so on, the findings, to the point where it can take several months to actually get an article published, even though you've already done the work well before that in terms of data collection and so on. So yeah, even book publications. I actually started writing a book and I found out how long it took in terms of a book chapter. Yeah, it takes quite a while. The article is published in one's home country. I think we've talked about this already with the whole not invented here bias. But essentially, yeah, there's often this idea that the perfect article, the unicorn article, will have already been published within your own home country, when that may not necessarily be the case. It might be located elsewhere on the globe. So something to consider there too. The article supports the researcher's point of view. Again, this kind of relates to overconfidence as well as the confirmation bias, as well as other biases that we've already talked about, such as the framing effect. Essentially, that this perfect article will also provide the answer that you've already predetermined or already felt that was already relevant. So, and maybe that perfect article doesn't actually, it may actually challenge your existing point of view on a particular health condition or treatment or any type of clinical issue. The article is published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. Yeah, I already just kind of touched on how long it takes for a peer-reviewed academic journal article to be published. So you may be waiting for quite a while for that. But it's also to challenge the idea that just because it's peer-reviewed doesn't necessarily, it's not a mark of quality per se. You still have to evaluate it based on the rigor of its methodology, you know, the sample, was it really representative of the population that it was supposedly targeting? Stuff like that. Because even though maybe the journal itself published it, thought it was fine in terms of the peer review process, but you yourself as a clinician, you need to provide your own critical thought into, you know, is this article really that relevant or valuable to my own research, my own clinical work? Something to consider there. And then the other thing is that the article is listed within the first page of results in a database search. Don't we always love when we can find that one article that we really needed within the first page? It very, very rarely happens, as you probably experienced in your own case. So it does require some digging into the databases, and it may not even be in the database you were focusing on, like PubMed or Google Scholar for that matter as a search engine. It may be found somewhere else. Just because by virtue of the topic, the scope of the journal it was published in, or if it wasn't even a journal article at all, maybe it's a blog post or a white paper or any other type of gray literature, so-called. It may not be the traditional academic journal article that you were looking for. The article does not exist. So essentially the other ones that I was kind of talking about, those are kind of the misconceptions of what we have as the unicorn article. That's what we think is the ideal about the unicorn article. But, you know, begs the question, does the unicorn article exist? Well, probably not. Unfortunately, I hate to burst anyone's bubble in that regard. But unfortunately, for the most part, the unicorn article doesn't really exist. That's kind of why it's called the unicorn. That's why I kind of put the label on there for it, is that it's something that we're constantly chasing for. But honestly, what really is going to probably happen as a researcher, as a clinician, is that you're going to have to do a lot of work in terms of curating a bunch of different sources, a bunch of different pieces of evidence, and really synthesize it into a collective that works for you, that really informs your research or informs your clinical decision making. So the unicorn article is probably just pieces of articles everywhere, essentially. So to briefly kind of talk about some debiasing techniques and what you can do, I think one of the things to stress here is that it's actually been challenged in the research whether you can actually debias your cognitive biases in research within every kind of context. The reason being is that the argument is that how fruitful or how effective it is to try to debias your brain by using your brain to debias, right? In the sense of like, it just seems kind of a catch-22 in the sense of like, it doesn't really make any sense of using the same brain that's making the mistakes to try to debias it from making those same mistakes. That's what I mean there. But there have been some documented ways of really trying to at least mitigate the effects of cognitive bias. You won't be able to fully eliminate it. I think that's something to stress here, but you can try to mitigate it. And it's an always ongoing practice. It's not something you just kind of do a one-stop session like this and you're fully debiased. No, it's an ongoing work. The first step really is to acknowledge your bias. Just acknowledge the fact that everyone, including yourself, is subject to bias in different forms, and it can manifest in different ways. You just have to be aware of it. Metacognition is basically being, it's really a fancy term for thinking about thinking. And really what that means is to be really critically thoughtful and mindful of how you're processing information, how you're searching for that information, and how you're evaluating it. Again, kind of that careful ongoing acknowledgement of your biases and really trying to pinpoint and identify where is it manifesting and how can I address that. Mental simulation, that's essentially kind of like a very empathetic means of relating to your patient or to your community under study. Really being able to step out of your own position as a researcher or as a clinician or as a person in general and really relating to the needs, the interests, and the expectations of who you're trying to treat, who you're trying to study. and really understanding them and what their outcomes are. Feedback, I think this is such a crucial part, is to always seek feedback from not only your colleagues, from even like your librarians, if you ever need like some type of look at like, hey, am I searching this right? You know, it's totally fine to ask, you know, whoever it might be, whoever you feel comfortable asking and who can provide a different perspective would be great. And this is also reflective of your own patients, your own communities under study. Really involving them in the decision-making process to make sure that what you're approaching them with in terms of treatments or research is really still relating to them. It's still effective to them, useful, and validating to them. Self-care, I think this is one of the key markers of bias, because with the constraints on time, constraints on resources, we probably get very stressed. We get very sleep deprived and so on. So it's really important to keep mindful of your own well-being, because essentially when you're tired, even when you're mildly dehydrated, you increase your proneness to cognitive bias and to it happening without you really noticing or really acknowledging it. Self-work, I think this is another great strategy where you really want to incorporate the idea that you're always constantly learning something and that you can always get better. And I think this session, just by virtue of you attending this session, you're already kind of on that progress, on that journey towards self-work. You're really trying to introduce yourself to the fact that you too can have limitations in your clinical decision-making, no matter how experienced you are. And there's always something to gain a better understanding of. So with that, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I think we do have enough time for the last activity, which was the Labyrinth part, which I think is going to be the fun part. I think it's going to be a really cool way of us kind of ending this particular session. So with that, let me bring over the link to that. I think you're going to really like it, hopefully. I'm really excited. But I think this is a really great way to kind of really interact with what we just learned here. So I invite you in the chat, there's a link I provided to it's basically a 3D virtual space that is essentially kind of escaping from the labyrinth kind of concept. So I'm going to actually move my share to that part. So yeah, I know we're at the end of the hour. I'm more than happy to stay around if you still want to play around with this for a little bit. That's totally fine. Or again, you can always feel free to check this out afterwards. The link should still exist for you, so you can always copy and paste it to your to wherever you want. And feel free to try it out and give me feedback too. If you can always contact me at mchase@USA. I'd be more than happy to hear some feedback about how I can improve upon it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Have a great night.
You too. Thank you. Have a great one, everyone.